Hey, welcome to room 102. Today we're going to be talking about some different watercolor techniques that we use in class. The first thing we're going to be doing is wet on dry. That means wet paint onto dry paper. When the paper is dry, it sort of sucks the paint, and what you'll get is something that feels a lot more like using maybe a magic marker than it does your typical watercolor. Watercolor should stay right where you put it. It shouldn't drip. You can get fairly detailed work as long as the paper is dry. So we'll talk about some contradictions and what to do when the paper is wet, but know that painting onto a dry surface gives you a different effect. The other thing we talk about in class is something called wet on wet. That means that you get the paper pre-wetted or pre-moistened before you paint. So you can see here I'm painting with just water, no color on my brush yet. When the paper is wet, the paint is free to move across the surface of the paper, which is nice for when you're painting a large area or when you want colors to blend together. And you can see that when I just drop the paint into the wet surface of the paper, the paint is already spreading out ahead of my brush. Kind of does a lot of the work for you if that's what you want. It's nice. You can drop in a couple colors, let them overlap, and they'll sort of intermingle as they float on the surface of the paper. Now, too much water is not your friend, so you don't want to have any puddles or bubbles of water, just a shiny sort of pre-moistened surface. So you can see I'm doing the same thing. A little bit of too much water there, but it's going to be fine. When I'm painting like a large background, I'll often pre-wet the paper and do just a wet on wash. Another term for this is a wash. And I can do a large area and I can get it to be pretty smooth. So an example of that right here would just be pre-wetting the paper. I usually do it in sections because it'll dry out anyway. And when you're painting, that little guy right there, that little blob of paint, that's referred to as a bead. I usually use just the tip of the brush, and all I'm really doing is moving the bead around. There he is again. There's the bead. Oh, there it is. You're just moving the bead around the paper. Think of it that way. I'm not brushing big strokes all over it with this little brush. I'm just moving that bead, and I'm letting that paint intermingle. You can use different techniques. So if I want to get something smooth, I might think of going in like even brush strokes. But if I just want it to look a little bit more natural, I can just move it around. Once it's blended, it's best to not kind of go back into it and mess it too much, because as the paper is drying, you're going to get a different technique. Another time when you would get a wet on wet is when you're painting something, maybe a wet on dry, like we just mentioned, but the paint overlaps. So I haven't gotten this little banner wet, but if I overlap the blue onto the purple, it's essentially the same thing as we just did. The purple is wet paint. It's just colored water. So if I overlap a new color of paint onto my original color, it's essentially a wet on wet situation. All right, dry brush highlights. So we did our wet on dry, and now it's very dry. You can go back and get a lot of detailed work once your paint is dry. So do your underpainting and then go back with a brush that doesn't have very much water on it. And you can get all sorts of detailed work that you cannot get the initial kind of paint through. If you try to get detailed work like this while your paint is wet, these colors are just going to blend together and you're going to have a real mess on your hands. So if you want things that have very specific or detailed colors, patterns, brushwork, you have to wait for your initial layers to be dry, all the way dry. And then you can go back in and you can get all the detailed stuff you want and paint right over things. One last thing we do in class is we practice doing a gradient. So there's a lot of times when you want to go from a dark to a light. So you're going to start with your color. And then what you're going to need to do is get that to lighten up. So I'm rinsing my brush out. And now all I have is essentially just water on my brush. And I'm just going to grab some more paint and bring it down. If yours doesn't lighten up again, rinse your brush off again and just bring that paint down. It's sort of like going from wet on dry to wet on wet. It's just this really gradient wash across the paper. It's a little tricky technique to master. Whoa, bump the camera. But once you get it, it all starts to make sense. Those are our major techniques for watercolor in class. Hope that that helps you get started on your first project. Thanks for joining us.